Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well. I hope God is blessing you in the moment. It's amazing. It's been almost 4 months since we went into our homes in confinement because of the coronavirus. What's God been doing in your life these last 4 months? How has God revealed himself to you? Where have you seen him at work? And what has this done to alter your life? Where has God called you to work and put your time and energy? What has stayed the same? If someone were to think of Paul's life when Paul was in prison, when he was confined, they might think that his ministry was confined, that God's work was confined in his life. But that would be wrong. I want to tell you the backstory to the letter to Philemon, which Paul wrote from prison. It's a letter that we're looking at over the next few weeks. Philemon was a man who owned slaves. He was wealthy. He had servants, no different than many other people that were wealthy in that day and age. God worked in his life, and Paul worked in his life. It's very evident through Paul's words to Philemon that there was a relationship that had gone on for quite a while where Paul had discipled Philemon. Philemon now runs a house church. And Philemon had a slave, a servant at one point named Onesimus. Onesimus at some point in his life ran away. He fled Philemon. And it sounds like from the letter that he might have taken something when he fled. Of all the places that Onesimus fled to, he fled to Rome. And somehow, some way, we know how God works in these ways, God led Onesimus to Paul. Isn't that amazing? Here's this man, he's on the run, and where does God lead him? To Paul, who's in prison. You see, God was still at work when Paul was in prison. It reminds me of the words of David in Psalm 139, where he says in verse 7, "Where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me." That wherever David goes, he recognizes God is there. God's already been there, and God is at work. And even though Paul is confined in prison, that doesn't mean that God is confined. Paul could probably tell the story of how he was in Philippi with Silas and in prison, and then while he was in prison, God released him from it. So while Paul's in prison, God is doing his work, leading Onesimus to him. And the truth is that whatever's going on in your life, in our confinement, if you will, God is at work. Where do you see him at work? Paul, in response to recognizing God's work, disciples Onesimus. We have this phrase where he says in verse 10 of Philemon, "I appeal to you," he's appealing to Philemon, "from my child, Onesimus, whose father I became in my imprisonment." And this word father is a word that's used that the father's process or the father's participation in the birthing process. In other words, what Paul is doing is he's continuing to doing what he did before. He's discipling Onesimus. And not only that, is in the letter that he writes to Philemon, he's discipling Philemon as he's calling him to reconcile with Philemon, which we're going to, Onesimus and Philemon to reconcile together, which we'll look at in a few weeks. But he also says in verse 21, "Confident of your obedience, I write to you." He's trying to help Philemon to obey Jesus in all of this. He's making disciples. Now, making disciples means that we are helping others grow in their relationship with Jesus. We are helping them to learn about this life with Jesus. We are modeling to them this life with Jesus, and we are continuing to push them that they might grow in their life with Jesus. Who are you discipling? Are you discipling others during this time? The discipleship process begins before people even come to know Jesus. That there is a sense that Paul was discipling Onesimus to faith. That means he was coaching Onesimus to know Jesus and continuing even further with it. And so God is calling each and every one of us to do the same, to disciple others. Do you remember in the Great Commission it says, as you go, or go therefore and make disciples? Well, the main verb there is to make disciples. And what he's saying is that wherever you go in life, you are to make disciples as you go in life. Whether you are free or you're in prison, God's command has not changed. We're called to love God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength. We're called to love one another as He has loved us, and we're called to make disciples. And so what has God been doing in your life to bring you to others that you might disciple them? How have you been growing in your faith, trusting in God and seeing Him at work? You know, some things are not much different. I mean, God's still working and God's still calling us to do it, but yet things are different, right? Paul couldn't disciple Philemon the same way he would have discipled Timothy. He couldn't take him out on the ministry trail with him and show him what to do. He had to do it behind bars and to speak into his life. In the same way, things have changed, right? We can't go to church as often as we used to. We can't be with others the same way we used to, but still things are the same. We're still called to do it. It might look different, but we're still called to make disciples. So where is God working in your life? Who are the people that God are bringing to your life, even in your confinement, that God wants you to minister to, that God wants you to love, that God wants you to disciple, so that they would become a mature follower in Jesus Christ? You know, as we go through this time of confinement, God is at work. God can be with you at your home when you're confined, or He could be with all of us when we're at church together. How will you respond? And may God bless you in all you do.